Hello, everybody. Since I earlier announced the death of the Mesoamerican network meetings, I just learned that they have been revived. Yay! So here's Kirby Farah from USC, who is organizing the next meeting, and you should know about it.
Hi, all. You don't need to clap. This is not like that. This year, we will be holding the Mesoamerican Network Conference, November 16th. It's a Saturday at the University of Southern California. Some of you in here I know are already on my mailing list. I'll be sitting back there if anybody would like to get on it and drop me their card or their email so I can make sure you're in the loop. But I'm going to be sending out flyers soon. We have 10 presenters lined up, mostly professors, a few PhD students here in Southern California. So it's going to be great, and you all should join us. Thanks. Thank you.
Welcome back from the break, everyone. We hope you enjoyed the exhibition that our own Raquel Rojas has curated. Our next speaker is Barbra Mundi. She's a professor of art history at Fordham University. She specializes in the art and visual culture of 16th century Mexico. With Dana Liebsen, she co-created Vista's Visual Culture in Spanish America, 1520 to 1820. Her recent book, The Death of Aztec Tenochtitlan, The Life of Mexico City, was awarded the Bryce Wood Book Award from the Latin American Studies Association. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Barbra Mundi to present Lifestyles of Rich Aztecs and Famous Spaniards in Mexico City.
Well, thank you, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here. This is one of my favorite places to be. And I wonder if we could just put our hands together once again for Raquel and Erika and the rest of the Art History Society. They've just done this incredible organization job. And it is such a pleasure to be here where art history is king. So I also want to acknowledge the many contributions of Miguel León-Portilla, a pathfinder for those of us who seek to understand the great cultures of the Americas. Okay. So the quincentenary allows us to return to the events of the period of the Spanish invasion. And yesterday, many speakers took us to the city of Tenochtitlan during and after the war. We saw it during a low moment after its abandonment. We saw the city at its ebb, the Mexica defeated and on the run. But to leave the city there is, I think, a mistake, because it leaves the impression that the Mexica were weak and that conquest is the eternal fate of indigenous peoples. And not only is this not true, these are dangerous tropes. Dangerous tropes about weak Mexicans here in the United States and on a world stage. And dangerous and untrue tropes about the extinction of indigenous peoples and their cultures. So today, we'll return to Mexico City after the invasion and see a different story unfold. Exactly 500 years ago, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, which we know today as Mexico City, was one of the world's largest cities. It was also one of the world's great engineering feats. The Mexica had built their island capital in the middle of a shallow lake, and in this imagined reconstruction of the 1950s, we can see an aerial view of the city as it appeared around 1500. Here you can see the complicated system of dikes that protected the lake from floods, those arteries leading in and out of the city. The irregular contours of the island, The irregular contours of the island were the result of 2 centuries of land reclamation, and the island was built outward to hold an expanding population. Aqueducts tapping springs on the mainland supplied the city with fresh water. Now let's put the achievements of the Mexica as urbanists and empire builders in perspective. The size of Tenochtitlan was about 1,500 people, and it was equivalent to some of the largest cities of Europe of the time. In the early 16th century, Paris was certainly the largest city in Europe, with about 260,000 residents. Naples had about 150,000, and Seville and Rome were smaller, with 55,000, and the latter would ebb to about 125,000 following its sack in 1527. Now, as most European histories tell it, in 1521, the Mexica presence in the city was extinguished in the wake of the Spanish invasion. But this was hardly the case. Less than a generation after the invasion, we find the city divided into two republics, the República de Españoles and the República de Indios. The Spanish residents of this great city were under the control of the viceroy. His portrait appears on the left, and it was probably made after his death in that he's adopted the sober garb of Spanish officials that they would wear to imitate their king in the later reign of Philip II. On the right is one of the first rulers of the República de Indios, and that is Don Diego Huanitzin. He was seated in office around 1527, and he was called a gobernador, a special office specifically designed to replace the Mexica Huetlatoani, or great speaker who headed the Aztec Empire. Taking office when the city's indigenous population was close to 100,000 people, Huanitzin's power over human beings and over acreage was considerable. His bloodline was impeccable. He was the son-in-law and nephew of Moctezuma, the assassinated emperor. And the gobernadors who followed him as rulers of the 16th century city were equally highborn, holding power into the 17th century. The exchanges between the viceroys and the indigenous gobernadores, all of them wealthy and powerful men, would shape the city. Now, a map of the center of Mexico City both reveals and hides this urban story. It is one of the few 16th century maps of the city made around 1564, and it shows us the Plaza Mayor, now called the Zócalo. That's one of the second largest urban plazas in the world. By this time, a small cathedral had been constructed, but it was dwarfed by the palace of the Cortés family on the west side of the plaza. Here, the royal palace sat on the east. It was here that the viceroy lived in relative splendor, and today that same palace, greatly expanded, is Mexico's national palace. But the map crops out the larger city, and in doing so, hides the tens of thousands of indigenous residents who were born, who ate and slept, who bought and sold, and who sang and danced within the city. It is as if the native peoples who made this city were disappeared. The maps show us the great Plaza Mayor as a blank. But today, to live out the promise of my title, I want to spend some time trying to rediscover what this map renders invisible, the lives of rich Aztecs, or Mexica, as they call themselves, in this city. And I'm going to spend some time looking at one of the great codices that was made in Mexico City to find this hidden history. This is the Codex of Tlatelolco. The Codex is an annal-style history offering a timeline of events beginning in 1542 and ending in 1560. Now, in Mexico City, the resident Mexica were actually two groups, the Tenochca and the Tlatelolca, the Tlatelolco living in the area to the north. On the right, the Codex Mendoza tells the history of the Tenochca rulers and their tortured relationship with the Tlatelolca. This page features the ruler Axayacatl. We see 13 years of Axayacatl's rule represented by the turquoise glyphs in the line to the left. Axayacatl sits about the middle of the page, and he's surrounded by the place names of the places that he's conquered. Most prominent is his conquest of Tlatelolco in 1573. It's so significant, in fact, that it's shown as a full narrative image. Moquihuish the Tlatoani of Tlatelolco, is shown dead, tumbling down from the pyramids. Flames appear from their roof combs, further emphasizing their defeat. That's the view of the Tenochca, but the Tlatelolco Codex shows their view of things. Now, we're going to leave their defeat in 1573 behind for the moment, and we're going to move forward to 1557. At that moment, orders had arrived in Mexico City that it was to celebrate the succession of the new Spanish monarch, Philip II, with a jura, or oath of allegiance, taken by all royal officials. The official jura was held on the Plaza Mayor, or Zocalo, on June 6, 1557, and it was celebrated with exceptional pomp. The Tlatelolco Codex offers us a rare image of what transpired on the plaza, which we saw as a blank space on the other map. Now we're going to look at two groups of the rich and powerful that came together on the Zocalo to celebrate the faraway king. Above, we see the República de Españoles, and below, the República de Indios. Let's deal with the Spanish first. On a low platform, the highest Spanish officials of the land sit, Don Luis de Velasco and the formidable Archbishop Alonso de Montúfar. A standard bearer holds a flag to the left. The two men, representatives of the church and state that Oscar Macinas so nicely told us about, are dressed in festive splendor. Above their heads, the artist has written their names in hieroglyphic script. The only texts in the manuscripts are written thus. I'll draw your attention to Velasco's cutting-edge fashion. He's wearing a fitted jacket with a fur collar, tight leggings, slit breeches. And his claim to authority as representative of the king is made clear by his choice to mimic his monarch's fashion choices. Below, we see the high indigenous officials of the land. Here is Imelyantzin. Next is Sesitzin. Next is Totoyquihuatzin. And then there is Don Hernando de Pimentel. Remember him because we're going to look at his forebear in just a minute. Now, Imelyantzin, who took the patronymic of the first viceroy, was an important figure. He may have been one of the patrons of the manuscript, as he's taken great care in having his appearance represented. Just as the viceroy's costume showed his link to his monarch, Imelyantzin's self-presentation would have been resonant with an indigenous public. However, it connected him not to a contemporary monarch or moment, but to a millennial-long tradition of indigenous rule. He wears the xihuitzoli, the turquoise mitre on his head. He's cloaked in a tilmatli with a distinctive design of black rings. And he's seated in the tepot ixpali, the high-backed throne. Other codices help us understand the significance of the ruler's costume. One important codex is the Codex Ixtlilxochitl, which presents the rulers of Texcoco. And you'll remember how we just met Don Hernando de Pimentel, the descendants of Nezahualpilli. He was the great poet king of Texcoco, and he is shown in sartorial splendor. He wears a turquoise tilmatli, hammered gold arm bands and leg bands, and a necklace of heavy jade beads. He holds a feather fan and fragrant flowers in his hands. We're going to zoom in, though, on his most elegant item, his loincloth. And we're going to read the elaborate symbols that have been stitched and woven into his garment. Here, on the lower edge are 4 cactuses like this, and they're better seen upside down. These cactuses came with associations of world trees and sacrifice that I won't unpack here. Instead, I want to turn to the upper symbol, which is a cave mouth. I'll stretch it out a little so you can see. Now, in linking himself to the cave, Nezahualpilli was drawing on a long tradition. Over 2,000 years before, Olmec rulers had shown themselves emerging from caves, proclaiming their role in bringing rain and life-giving maize to the human community. rulers' semi-divine status was traced to their birth from caves, making the placement of the cave over Nezoapili's genitals especially important. Equally important was the headdress that he wears. It was made out of a turquoise mosaic. Now, while we have no surviving headdresses like this one, we do have examples of turquoise mosaics, which were so extraordinary that they were avidly collected by Europeans. In this example, we have micro-mosaics of the highest quality workmanship, and they were seen as coming from the Toltecs, those great artisans of the past. Now, turquoise is not found in central Mexico, and so it was a potent sign of imperial reach, as the emperor signals the trade networks that tied him to distant places through the headdress that he wore. The throne and the cloak of Imalyansin are equally significant. The woven reeds, or wicker, would seem to be a very poor material for a noble throne. But they, like the cave, have a long association with rulership. In the Maya city of Copan, the Popolná, or house where the community rulers met, was decorated with the same woven mat design. And the metaphor makes sense. Individually, reeds have tough fibers, and they grow in a very chaotic fashion. It's only when they're organized into a tight weave that they can support humans. For the chaotic human community, the ruler is like the mat maker. Imalyansin's cloak uses another architectural metaphor. The round discs are symbols of preciousness, and they decorated elite architecture across Mesoamerica. Archaeological excavations at Tepozcalula reveal what they look like. So in his clothing, Imalyansin marshaled powerful metaphors about rulership and its relationship to the human community. But perhaps the most extraordinary element of this scene of the Jura of 1557 are the dancers below. Imalyansin is linked to them with this very significant red line, perhaps to indicate his sponsorship of the event. The dancers are performing something Spanish observers would know as the mitotes. The ceremonial dance was a tradition dating way back to the pre-Hispanic period. Mitotes, and the word comes from the Nahuatl itotia, or to dance, were particularly important in the consecration of pre-Hispanic rulers, where they had a sacralizing function akin to bloodletting. A multicolored bird to the left, it stands at the left, and below are three dancers wearing outfits made entirely out of feathers. One of them represents an eagle with his raptor's beak, and then two others are jaguars or spotted ocelots. The eagle dancer carries a large flower in his hand. Now, these very same mitotes are pictured in the Florentine Codex, where they present the dances in honor of Huitzilopochtli. I draw your attention to the figure at the left, who also carries that same huacalxochitl flower and leaf. Now, these flowers, carried in both mitotes, were connected to rulership and a leader's potency, specifically his sexual potency. Sahagún, in fact, in one of those rare moments where he actually pays attention to what women are doing when men aren't looking, comments that the palace ladies would use it for pleasure when the ruler was out of town. I'll leave that to your imagination. Now, feathered costumes had in general been associated with military conquest. This page of the Codex Mendoza shows us the tribute delivered to pre-Hispanic Mexica lords in Tenochtitlan. We see 4 sets of war costumes and shields, all of them made out of feathers. Through successful conquest, the Mexica and Tenochtitlan were able to demand tribute of the subject provinces in the form of feather costumes. And those costumes, in turn, were awarded to the most successful Mexica warriors to be worn into battle, thus perpetuating the cycle of conquests. At the bottom left, here, is a spotted ocelot costume, and it bears close resemblance to the costume at left. Indigenous audiences of the 16th century certainly remembered the prestige of feather costumes when they saw these dances. And in fact, there's pretty good evidence to suggest that what we're seeing in the mitotes here are heritage military costumes that have been repurposed for use in the mitotes or dances. The figure at the right also carries a red oval fan whose base is a tight ring of feathers. In his hand, 4 pendants ending with feathers dangles. Feathers like these, the roseate spoonbill feathers, either alone or in warrior outfits, were all the result of imperial tribute. And this is the point that Imauyansin wants to drive home. So in the Codex Tlatelolco, we begin to see how the empty space that the map shows us in the Plaza Mayor or Zocalo was filled with celebration. Here, rich Spaniards and rich Aztecs came together to strut their stuff. The Mexica, though, could offer reminders about the history and the deep antiquity of their right to rule, something that the Spanish invaders could never do. And Imauyansin was able also to upright the wrongs of 1473 by means of showing himself as the most important leader and patron of the dances. In my very last part of this talk, I want to show you some of the examples that are lesser known to art historians and others that offer evidence that shows how Mexica elites like Juanitzin and Imauyansin continued their spectacular feasting culture through the 16th century. We've seen, for example, how important decorated cloaks were to show elite statuses. This portrait of Tecuepotzin from the Codex Ixoxitl shows us his cloak bordered with an embroidered design called the tenicho. A tribute document from well after the invasion shows us women creating exactly these same borders for the Mexica gubernadores. In this case, the women have produced 365 borders, no doubt to decorate the cloaks of palace nobles. Another page of the same tribute record shows the sculptors who are creating vessels in the form of birds to be used in the palace feasts. A surviving example from before the invasion shows us the beauty and the craftsmanship of such elegant ritual vessels. My colleague, the archaeologist Enrique Rodriguez Alegría, has done excavations in the center of Mexico, and he's found that Spanish invaders were adopting all the hallmarks of Mexica feasting culture in their palaces, disrupting our view of an entrenched ethnic divisions in the city. Instead, the rich and the powerful partied together. The new indigenous lords of Mexico City were pushed off, certainly, from living on the Plaza Mayor, but they built palaces elsewhere. And in this image of the gobernador's palace in Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, we see how its designer used roof decorations of round rings to mark its importance. Below, the indigenous gobernador of the city converses with the Viceroy Velasco, and they are pictured on equal footing. Again, the architecture of the map is empty, but I hope this talk has helped you see how it might have been populated. With a ruler whose dress connected him to a Mexica divine right of kinship. With dancers whose mitotes were necessary for sacralizing any event and whose feathered outfits connected them to Mexica military might. And a public who could understand and participate in the sights and sounds of the spectacle. Participation in such events was one of the elements that made them the Mexica, an identification that they did not lose even after the invasion. So today, we all know that the mitotes have escaped the palace walls, danced again in the Zocalo and in the streets of Los Angeles, They invite us to think about the ways that the ancient festival culture of the Americas lives on. And because it does, it also invites us to discard the tired untruths of weak Mexicans and perpetually conquered indigenous peoples. And danced here in our California streets, where they become part of our collective identity, they also invite us to reimagine what it means to be American. Thank you.
Our next speaker is John Pohl. He's a lecturer in anthropology at Cal State LA, an adjunct professor in art history at UCLA. In addition to academic pursuits, Dr. Pohl has had a prolific career as a writer, designer, a curator for major museums and exhibitions around the country, including the Aztec Pantheon and the Art of Empire for the Getty Villa Museum, and the Children of Plumed Serpent, the Legacy of Quetzalcoatl in Ancient Mexico, for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and Dallas Museum of Art. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pohl to present the After Conquest Indigenous Strategies of Empowerment in the Early Modern Global World.
So can I get the lights? Did the lights go down, or could one component be turned off? Just if you can't, that's fine. But if we can, I'd like to. That would be good. That's perfect. Yeah, that's exactly what I want. Okay, thank you very much. I want to get into the presentation, but I can't tell you how much I appreciate everything that the staff at the Getty and here at Cal State LA. Our own students that I appreciate especially, and I think Manuel, if I can't tell you, having worked with Manuel for over 10 years, the amount of work and thinking, a lot of this stuff, not this particular one, this is all Manuel's brainchild, but he and I have brainstormed a lot of these things in the past, and it's taken a lot of eating Japanese noodles and staying up over at his apartment at 3 o'clock in the morning, and we don't have a lot of resources here, so this always comes off very, very well thanks to our students. But it takes an enormous amount of ingenuity and resourcefulness on the part of the staff and the people here, our students, and Manuel especially. So I want to compliment them. Thank you very much. Okay. All right, I'm going to begin with something we're all familiar with, and I do want to make one quick point, and that is that I was very interested in the discussion between Eduardo and the scholars on the first day. I have purposely have another career, which is popularization, and did write a book called The Aztec Warrior, which is largely based on Book 12 of the Florentine Codex, which was issued through a military series called the Osprey Military Series. And I have sold over 80,000 copies of that book. So there is a popularization of this material. There is a general understanding of a lot of these perspectives. And I think one of the issues is how this material is distributed in popularization, not the fact that it doesn't exist. So we need to have more of a powwow about scholars, indigenous people, and popularization. I also even produced a television program on this many years ago that featured Kevin Terracciano in this kind of perspective. So we'll go back to Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma II, and you're all familiar with the fact that this was an empire that grew and was predicated upon the extraction of wealth through tribute throughout primarily, I would argue, southern Mexico. And particularly one area that I have developed, this is the Confederacy that I used as the basis for my exhibition, The Children of the Plumed Serpent, The Legend of Quetzalcoatl in ancient Mexico for the LA County Museum of Art. I have constructed this with a number of principles. The first is that these are not urban societies. These are city-state societies, generally occupied or maintained by elites living in palaces. It's a palace network system. It's predicated on royal marriages, and that's what you're seeing in this map here. These are the people who are, the economy that you see in Codex Mendoza is not an Aztec imperial economy originally. It is a Pacific coastal economy that is being moved from Ecuador to the greater Southwest, West Mexico, by these coastal peoples. And that is why we're having a Dumbarton Oaks conference this coming week, specifically to shift emphasis over to the Pacific coast and this interaction. The Mixtecs and Zapotecs in particular, with their centers at Tututepec and Tehuantepec on the coast, are the people who are pumping this wealth into that system in southern Mexico, where it's being transformed into these kinds of objects that are circulating in bride wealth and gift exchange systems. This isn't a military system. And as many of you have seen me lecture before, it's the Aztec extraction of this wealth through military conquest that is the secret behind the enrichment of the Aztec empire. Much of this is actually being produced by palace women. They are the engineers of this economy. Now, you're all familiar with my research, I think, in the Mixtec codices and the codices, and what can we do with the codices. I want to draw out just a few themes here to kind of set up part of my argument. The first is that we know that they were performed. They were hung on walls, and this is a very specific Mixtec and Zapotec quality of these. They were sung by court poets who were very interested in reciting together with attended nobles in feasts the stories of their common origins of the dynasties at the creation of the world. So Codex Nuttall, for example, at the beginning of time, we see the priests, not the kings themselves, not the kings and queens, not the caciques and cacicas, but the priests descending on ropes to bring the sacred bundles to establish the first communities. This is very clearly documented even in colonial trials, later idolatry trials in Yanhuitlan in the valley of Nochixtlan, as being the festivals we know as volador rituals. Now, following this, we have a conflict. It's an ethnic conflict in which the stars in the sky and the stones of the earth come to life and attack the first founders of these genealogies. Here's two of the stone men battling a nine-wind flint helmet over control and establishment of the first land. These stone men are still known today. Pieces of fragments of limestone cliff face that fall into valleys are still identified as these original inhabitants that had been turned to stone by the rising of the first sun. And then we can very clearly see in Codex Nuttall that the first dynasty of Tilantongo, the highest ranked Mixtec dynasty, is a resolution of the conflict between the stone people and the first Mixtec nobles through royal marriage. And from these royal marriages, we then see a continuation in the Codex of the genealogies that subsequently follow all the way up to the eve of the conquest. Now, we're all familiar with the conquest of Tenochtitlan, especially after the last 3 days, or 2.5 days. But I want to call your attention to something that is very dramatic here that transforms southern Mexico. With the removal of the pressure, the removal of the conquest paradigm from southern Mexico, we see it now a dramatic change in culture here. Kevin Terracciano is the person who's written sort of our major work, Ron Spores originally, and Kevin doing with his dissertation and his master work on the relationship of the caciques, the cacicas, and the Dominicans in particular. I've gone further with this and argued that, in fact, my pre-Columbian marriage system is just simply kicking back in again, and this is largely what is driving the production of manuscripts and lienzos, especially in the pre-Columbian tradition and the post-classic. Now, this powerful alliance between the caciques and the Dominicans and the amount of wealth that they are beginning to be able to acquire together, with the fact that with the Nahuas of the Plain of Puebla, the Mixtecs and the Zapotecs, especially with a book composed by Laura Matthews and Michelle Audick called Indian Conquistadors. This is a whole new epic. This is a whole new era. The roots of this are actually before the Mexica. The roots of this are in southern Mexico between 1200 up to 1450. Then the Mexica rise. Then we see the rise of the Valley of Mexico. With the collapse of the Mexica Empire, we see a resurrection of this system. That was the message in the Children of the Plumed Serpent. These are the armies that then come from southern Mexico that then compose first the army. I think it's fascinating that they reorganize on the Oaxaca coast. Under Alvarado, they move on highland Guatemala, and under Coronado, under Coronado, they move into the southwest. It is the Plain of Puebla and Oaxaca that is contributing to this. And this is in the Matthews Audick book, there's a record of a receipt from a Tlaxcalteca cacique for the transport and delivery of armies to the Philippines. And when you really think about it, well, how many Spaniards are really going to be able to go to the Philippines? So just as we consider the role of these people in the conquest of Mesoamerica, following the fall of Tenochtitlan, we should start researching this in the Philippines as well. Now, the empowerment of the Dominicans and the caciques, particularly Nahua, Mixtec, and Zapotec caciques in Oaxaca, leads to some formidable wealth in terms of just overall wealth. The first thing is that the caciques now are in the position to monopolize the transport of the wealth of the Philippines from originally Huatulco, which was the kingdom of Tututepec's principal port, across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec to Veracruz for reshipment onto Spain. And this leads to, of course, a major introduction of Chinese porcelain, and with the sponsorship of populations into opening up the silver mines into first San Luis Potosí and ultimately to Saltillo and then Santa Fe, the silver component that enriches Mexico, the New Spain as well. These are indigenous movements. The indigenous people have been demonstrated to be, together with the Dominicans for their as a partnership, their business partners, revolutionized the economy of New Spain at this time. Now, as I've argued, these marriages kick back in again, and this can be shown in a lot of these documents that we all study as lienzos and maps in the colonial period. I've kind of begun to shift over from the codices as history books and started to focus, and I'm very happy to see Barbara actually shift into this as well, to the performative, and there were several other papers at this conference that did this, the performative aspect of this. I've always argued the performative aspect of codices in courtly situations, but let's think about the plazas and how these things would play out. So I've always been fascinated by the Biombo at the LA County Museum of Art. It's actually, it's had different titles. I don't know what it's called right at the moment, but this is a marriage scene. So we have the marriage couple, which I see as the primary component of the theme in the codices from pre-Columbian times. We have the voladores, which I see as one of the creation stories, primary creation stories in Codex Nuttall for the foundation of these dynasties. And then we have the dance itself, and it's a dance of ethnic conflict. It's known as Danza de la Pluma, and I don't know what other information other people have, but according to Francisco de Burgoa, it was originally developed by Mixtecs and Zapotecs at Cuilapan. So as pervasive as this dance is throughout what was New Spain today, the greater southwest, northern Mexico, and Mexico itself, that is what Burgoa says. And it is rooted in exactly the same performance of this ethnic conflict. Now, layered into this is another popular theme, the other popular theme in the Biombos, which is the conquest of Tenochtitlan itself. And when I did the Aztec Pantheon exhibition, I argued, and have written about this, argued that these are not paintings from memory. These are paintings of performances as they took place in Mexico, probably in the middle of the 7th to the late 17th century. Layered into this is the sense of divinity then that are in the original stories possessed, utilized, deployed by the Nahuas, Mixtecs, Zapotecs, and those they dominated, by including not only Santiago Matamoros, but transforming him into Santiago Mata Indios. I remember when Manuel took me to see this for the first time in Tlatelolco, and I was astounded, and that was a great day for me. It was also my birthday. Okay, you all are familiar with the continuation of all of this as Gela Getza, and this has been the focus of someone I am in partnership in this study with, which is Xochitl Flores Marcial. It is the direct continuation of this tradition. Specifically, Burgoa says this is the origin of this dance, is at Quilapan with the Festival of Santiago. And what's so fascinating about it is, and I think this is important, is that it too conflates a lot of different historical events and tweaks them and twists them in ways that are very important. With Xochitl's work, I think it's significant that they have completely twisted around the relationships between Malinche and Moctezuma, and in fact there are two Malinches, and that in this case we have Moctezuma married to Malinche, for example, pumping up the marriage aspect of the festival. Now, most recently, together with my colleagues, we've been working on the coast of Oaxaca, particularly the Chontal and Huave peoples, who do not speak languages related to any other Mesoamerican group. We suspect they may be related to languages in Nicaragua, and at one time, and I still think this is a probability, Chontal is related to languages, Hokan languages here in California. Now, the principal port in this area, Chontal, together with these are marginalized groups today, is the port and tourist area of Huatulco. What we're focusing on is the Chontal Festival of San Pablo in Huamelula, Oaxaca, which is just down the coast from Huatulco, which features no Spaniards. This is a variation on the Danza de la Pluma, the Danza de la Conquista, except it doesn't have any Spaniards in it. Instead, we have the Turcos Pechelingues, and they have a pirate ship, and they come to town. They wage war. There's a ritual combat between two ethnic factions. I don't have time to go into the Negritos, but the Negritos get into a conflict with the Turcos Pechelingues, with the Turcos Pechelingues defeating the Negritos, and then instead of a volador ceremony, ritually hang them from the yardarm. Literally tie the rope around their leg and string them up as if they are being punished. Now, the resolution of conflict comes when all of the factions unite at the church and we have a wedding. Before we have a wedding, though, we have to have a baptism, and the reason why is that what we have to baptize is the Huave Princess Crocodile, who you see here, who is now going to marry the Chontal Presidente, thereby formulating and commemorating an historical alliance between the Chontal and Huave people. If you think her baptismal outfit looks good, you should see her wedding trousseau. So what is this? What's going on here? What happened to the Spaniards, and how are these two groups doing this? Nobody we've been encountering. I mean, this has kind of been known, but nobody was encountering really what the history of this is. So what kind of history is this? Well, you're all familiar with the Turcos. I mean, they are Spain's ultimate enemies. This is a painting of the Battle of Lepanto, for example. The Pechelingues, though, are more mysterious. Who would these people be? Well, it turns out they're the sailors of the Netherlands, and you know them primarily as pirates, but that's not what they are. They actually are coming out of Vlissingen, which is, we would know it as Flushing, like Flushing, New York. Vlissingen is the primary port in the 16th century for the recruitment of sailors for all of the Dutch economic enterprises around the world. The problem that emerges here is that these Dutch cities all convert to Calvinism in order to, these are all business-oriented people, in order to begin to relieve themselves of particularly the ties to the Catholic Church and other things that they see are impeding their ability to do trade in the way they would like it. They bond with the Huguenots in Calais, and originally at first, the first hit on what the impending wealth that's going to come in from the Americas is a Calais-based Protestant, Jean Fleury de Honfleur, who hits Cortez's treasure ship in 1523. And you can imagine what the effect of looking at all of this gold was to the rest of, particularly these Protestant merchants, with the impact of what the potential was in the New World. This, of course, was of great concern, not only to Charles V, but Philip II, who immediately, well, not immediately, but by the 1560s is turning on these Dutch merchant states, imposing the Holy Office of the Inquisition, military occupation, and literally genocide. The Spanish army invades the Netherlands and starts to literally kill citizens. Now, this is all playing out at the same time that we have initially the Manila galleon trade operating in only one direction only, out of Huatulco. However, in 1565, the return route is found. The Manila galleon comes down the coast of California and then back to Mexico. Because of the difficulty in defending Huatulco, the port is actually shifted to Acapulco. I find it fascinating that in 1566, Leiden then declares its independence. Basically, the return route cuts the Dutch out entirely of the entire trading enterprise that their liege lords, the people they owe their fealty to, the King of Spain, are entirely eliminated. Within 2 years, all of the cities, all of the merchant cities, there is no concept of a nation of the Netherlands at this time. These are independent trading cities. Revolt, they are all Protestant. They elect the only prince they really have, William, Prince of Orange, as their leader. And now we are seeing the Dutch and the Spanish engage in what's known as the 80 Years' War of Independence from 1568 to 1648. Now, the Dutch only have three strategies. One is to flood the land, which quagmires the Spanish army. Direct engagement at sea by sailing down the rivers and taking on the Spaniards in the English Channel and the North Atlantic. And then finally, and this is what's critical, attacking Spanish colonial interests in the Pacific and the Caribbean. The first account I can find of a Dutch ship appearing in the Pacific is coming from an account in Nayarit. And this is a record of a Francisco Chambrillo, who is around here, the dates are a little fuzzy, but between 1557 and 1565. The question is, how in the heck did he get there? 1565 is the year that they discover the return route from the Philippines. So this is a bit mysterious. We also know, though, that within a few years, Dutch ships are beginning to cruise the Pacific coast. And a curious thing emerges in that they're frequently being confused with Turcos. The reason is that the Dutch start flying the Turkish flag, which must have had a very dramatic effect to any Spaniard standing on the coast from Oaxaca to Nayarit to California, watching this Ottoman ship go by. The reality of it is that Dutch sailors were now wearing medals that say on them rather Turk than Papist. And in fact, you're probably familiar with Hendrik Hudson's ship, the Half Moon. The Half Moon is named for exactly that medal. And as we know, Hendrik Hudson's real mission was to try to find a Northwest Passage, and he ended up opening up the first negotiations with the Lenape and the Iroquois, and so doing it. So are these corsairs, pirates, privateering? That's how it's been dismissed. I would like to call this a forced economy. There is a planned system of a cohesive effort to move into territories once they've been cut out of the system by Philip II, to set up a system of economic development and exploration in other parts of the world with a specific strategy. Here's the distribution of the Dutch access to resources around the world by probably about 1650 to 1700. Let me give you an example of this. Let's take a look at South America. Now, we all know that the South American continent was divided up under Pope Alexander, with the Spaniards controlling these areas to the left, the pink areas, and Portugal ending up with the areas in Brazil and the ones to the right. Look what the Dutch do. They move into the intermediate areas. And in so doing, they formulate bonds with disenfranchised indigenous groups that have been cut out of the system by both the Spaniards and the Dutch. What I'm proposing then is that this is precisely what happened in Oaxaca. The Chontal and Waves are being pressured by the Mixtec and Zapotec caciques to pay tribute to them, and they in turn have this strong bond with the Dominicans and the support of the viceroyalty in doing this. Now, we know that the Chontal are in a critical area. They are part of the component of the maintenance originally of a pre-Columbian port, the port at Huatulco. And we find that fragments of Chinese porcelain in this area, as well as in the Mixteca. It's been found recently in the palace of the cacique Don Gabriel de Guzman at Yanhuitlan. Also, Oaxaca is full of gold. So these resources, including, for example, this remarkable serape, saltillo serape, is made entirely with gold thread and cochineal dyed cotton, and it's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So this is a critical region of wealth-producing area. So what is going on here? Well, when Huatulco, when the port is shifted, the Acapulco becomes the center of the Philippine trade, Huatulco should die off, but it doesn't. In fact, it gets richer. Well, what would explain this? What would explain it is that this area, as it is known today, becomes a pirate haven. Well, that's the vice-regal term for it. I would propose that this is now becoming a center of Dutch activity in this part of Oaxaca, and hence why it's being commemorated in that festival. To give you an example, here is an expedition that we all know from a famous print, because this is the print that shows us the first record of the indigenous sailing raft adapted to spondylus shell, the so-called Kontiki raft. I find it interesting that when he was preparing for his attack on Acapulco, he needed resources by the time he got to Ecuador, and rather, now this is in 1619. There are plenty of ways to pull into port. He is on a secret expedition, basically, and I find it interesting that there are people out there who, rather than using European boats, are still cruising those waters with this pre-Columbian sailing craft. This implies to me that Joris Spielbergen is accessing and making alliances with another one of these disenfranchised groups. But that's outside of my research area. So finally, in conclusion, what have we got here? Here's how I see this system working. It's a situation in which you have disenfranchisement. First, the trading cities of, the merchant cities of Holland, and then this is the strategy of initially raiding, but then eventually establishing centers of indigenous land-based supply, leads to a forced economy in regions in which both groups are now have been disenfranchised, and then this establishes a Dutch sea-based long-distance transport system. So this is a system. This is not piracy. The English are pirates. They only come in later and just copy what the Dutch are doing. In fact, Queen Elizabeth kept the English out of this when it first got started. So what's the secret behind the economy, and what's the name of it? It's the contraband economy. This is something that's been totally underestimated. It's been evaluated by those who are studying it as possibly being equal in wealth and production to the galleon economy itself. And finally, I find it fascinating that the Nobles' Compromise in the Netherlands of 1566 is specifically oriented to establishing this as a system. Now, finally, I just want to thank my colleagues, my team, which is Danny Zaborover, Aaron Sonnenschein, a professor of linguistics in my department here at Anthropology, Veronica Pacheco, and this is our associate, Nawi Oline Mendoza, and Xochitl Flores Marcial. We've very specifically using our talents in very different ways to put this together as an interdisciplinary study. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, now it's the time for lunch. That will be from now to 2:45 p.m. We have downstairs, we have Pollo Loco, and we have Carl's Jr. hamburgers. And I don't know if Sbarro pizzas are open or not, but for sure the other two I mentioned, so you can go there. And if you have not visited the exhibit of the organized by Raquel and her team, we encourage you to do it in some free time you have. And then we meet back here at 2:45. Thank you.